This is a Film Stories original podcast.
We made this.
Welcome to the X-Cast. The truth is in here. This is our special Fight the Future Minute podcast. I'm Kurt North, and you are listening to coverage of minute 81 of the X-Files Fight the Future. This minute begins at 80 minutes as Mulder heads towards the back of the bar and finishes at 80 minutes 59 as the car pulls out into the Washington D.C. with the Capitol building in the background. Well, I think it's the Capitol building. I'll get confirmation of that in a second. To discuss this minute, I am joined by X-Cast contributor, writer of the opening The X-Files, A Critical History of the Original Series, Darren Mooney. Darren, it's glad to be back. Glad to be talking about Well-Manicured Man again. We've been away for maybe about 20 minutes or so. So, first of all, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you? It's been a very long 20 minutes, but I guess that's how 2020 works, right?
Well, 2020 is never ending. So
I did a check and discovered that we're about halfway through now, which seems grand. It only feels like it's been 20 years.
Yeah. So as at time of recording, I think your pubs are back open.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ish.
Ish. Yes. I mean, and again, this is the thing. The wonderful thing about the Irish kind of like time of recording sort of coronavirus restriction lifting is that, again, yes, the pubs being open is kind of a big deal for us, not to live up to kind of Irish stereotypes or kind of, you know, cultural cliches or whatever. What is interesting, though, and you can kind of get a sense of perhaps how closely intertwined the public and landlord lobby is with our political class here in Ireland. It's the fact that it was determined that the safest way for pubs to reopen was the way that just happens to be the most economically fortuitous for them. So, if you are going to a pub, you cannot spend longer than 90 minutes there, meaning that you have a 90-minute turnover in the pub, which means that people are going to be encouraged to consume alcohol or to consume whatever they purchase as quickly as possible and get out of the way, vacating space and allowing people to be brought in who are also going to consume as well very, very quickly. It's very lucrative for publicans. On top of that, it's been determined that in order for pubs to reopen safely, people must be there for a substantive meal. Now, when we say substantive meal, again, in Ireland, you can tell that this was favouring the publicans. Substantive meal is not measured by quality of, say, calories or weight of the meal or anything like that. It's by price. You will have to order a piece of food that costs more than €9 in order to justify your 90-minute stay in a pub in Ireland. It's all very, very, very interesting. And again, it's fascinating how, while yes, pubs will have to deal with, say, social distancing restraints, although again, there's been a major push to get that down from 2 meters down to 1 meter. And again, there's, you know, a lot of stuff's been loosening around here as well. But there's also, again, that understanding that what you're going to have when pubs reopen, as we're recording, you're going to have a constant churn of customers who are very eager to get into pubs, very eager to socialize with friends, or even to have a pint, or even to just be in a social environment again, but constantly churned out in, say, it was 4 or 5 rotations of a night, each of which will be required to at least buy a meal in a pub, and then within that, presumably, try and get the money's worth or the time's worth out of that in terms of consuming drinks and alcohol. I think I understand why people are eager to go to pubs. I think it's you know, a necessary social function, particularly in, say, Irish villages and rural communities where the pub is the heart of the community. But I do find myself a little skeptical about the way in which kind of this has been pushed through in Ireland. I do find myself a little bit wary of it. I won't be availing of that service, at least in the short term, for the next 2 or 3 weeks, until I get a sense of how it's going. Sorry, this has turned into a very somber, very serious commentary on a situation. I apologize.
No, that's okay, because there's a tenuous link, because one, you being an author of several books, and two, it's probably best that you're not in any pubs, because I would be fearful for your life, because you might end up being put into the back of a boot of a car. So.
Sort of bundled up neatly, yeah. And the way in which it's kind of framed, it's like, did the Well-Manicured Man do it? The small little old, you know, OAP British dude, as opposed to the driver. Like, was the driver just sort of standing there, and the Well-Manicured Man's like, no, I got this. This is on me. Always wanted to do this. Just going to fold him neatly. Oh, he folds in half. That's convenient. Because he's not a short man, is Martin Landau.
No, he's quite gangly, isn't he, really? So, I mean, in the previous minute, we saw him going down the street and he's walking down there in his suit. And, I can imagine it being quite a lift. So I think the driver might have helped. But I'm sure we'll talk about the driver at some point in the next few minutes, because we are here for the next 6 minutes, I believe. So you've got almost a week of us on this journey. And as it happens, last time we spoke on our first minute, there was a slight crossover. So there was a bonus minute. We were considered a bonus minute. Woo! So yeah, exactly.
Supplemental, baby.
Now I know for a fact, because I've listened to Tony's minute, that Tony was on the previous minute, and we're okay. This minute is going to be fine. It is just us this time. We've got the spot on the stage alone. We're not supporting anyone. We are on stage in front row, sorted. It seems only fair that we're talking about, as I say, the scene there with Mulder. One of the things I wanted to say just at the very beginning here, I want to go to some of the technical aspects just for this first minute, because we have got 6 full minutes here of really interesting stuff and really important to the plot of the film. But there is a few things that I read in Jodie Duncan's book on the making of the X-Files, Fight the Future, and also just some of the aspects, particularly of these scenes in general, that I wanted to talk to you about. And that's I mean, especially the beginning part is a really nice tracking shot with Mulder in that bar. And that's obviously the bar that we had at the very beginning of the film. And thanks to Fight the Future Minute, I've now found out what 86 meant, because I had no idea that meant that they were going to get thrown out of a bar. I had no idea that was the case. So that was nice to find out. But what do you think to the aesthetics of these next few scenes, the kind of noir aspects? I know Rob Bowman talks about this, but in film history in general, with the way that the X-Files plays out in all of its seasons, really, that the aesthetic that they tend to go for is this type of thing.
It is indeed. I mean, well, first of all, yes, the tracking shot is quite actually impressive. Again, it's a small one. It's not particularly showy. You're not going to confuse it with, say, Martin Scorsese's work in Goodfellas or anything like that. That similar tracking shot into a bar and out of a bar. But it is particularly impressive because it happens so quickly and it's so elegant and it's so, non-showy for what it's doing. Where the Mulder comes into the bar, the camera whirls around him. While the camera is whirling around him, it takes in focus of the other people in the bar, so you get a sense of them reacting to Mulder. You get the camera pressing in close on Mulder to get his kind of panicked reaction. You have Duchovny moving through this space, which is an actual bar shot in Los Angeles, a Los Angeles bar. But you have the camera tracking Mulder as he goes through there, pushing away from him. And it's all like very frantic, very tense, very close up, which is exactly what you're going for. But it's the kind of shot that you wouldn't necessarily get away with on a weekly television show in the 90s, because obviously the idea there is to produce as quickly as possible, to get as much out of the location as quickly as possible, and to wrap and to cut and to cover your angles and get your sort of protect yourself in terms of editing. And so as a result, you tend to go more conservative in those sort of sequences. So you'd probably have a wide angle shot of him coming in, a close-up of him stopping, some reaction shots of the people at the bar, and then a shot of him leaving the bar if you were editing this for television. But the fact that Fight the Future is being produced for cinemas, for film, means that you have a bit of, you have a greater luxury in terms of how you're shooting, in terms of where you're shooting, in terms of the time you can devote to it, and in terms of the things you can try even within that. And again, we'll talk maybe when we get to the end of our kind of 6 minutes. So this is a nice little bookend in terms of like Fight the Future being an X-Files blockbuster for the mid-90s, and very much going all in on that, right down to stuff unnecessarily exploding, which is very much a hallmark of we're making a blockbuster movie. But you can see it even in kind of those little shots like the one of Mulder kind of running to the bar. Now, obviously, it does cut because presumably the alleyway in which he arrives is in a different location. It's not actually the alleyway off the bar that they shot in Los Angeles. But again, even within that kind of small sequence, within that small space of time, you get a really good sense of Bowman using kind of space and using kind of like film very, very well. And in terms of film noir influence as well, in terms of its influence on the X-Files, and again, a lot of the noir stuff is just kind of a visual aesthetic. It's contrasts in kind of blacks and whites and greys and light and stuff like that, and getting kind of a sharp difference between the two. And yes, the X-Files has always been very, very good in it. And I'd argue that's one of the reasons why, as a TV show, the X-Files has really benefited from a HD kind of remastering, as it were, a HD re-release, because it is actually a show that benefits from being watched kind of with a high definition set, without kind of the loss that you'd have on VHS or even on the kind of muddy colors you occasionally get on DVDs, and having that kind of really sharp contrast, and in particular the really, really, really rich blacks. And again, if you want to pick moments from this particular minute that we're talking about here, think of the moments where the well-manicured man is actually getting into the car and you have him silhouetted against kind of the black shadows in the alleyway as he's moving, where you have this very clear contrast between the light in which he's standing and the darkness behind him. And it's kind of rich, it's very deep, it's very striking. And again, it's very obviously cinematic in terms of this being a movie, but it's very indicative of how the X-Files has always kind of shot these. And again, we mentioned the alleyway. And we'll probably talk a little bit more about that in a second. But things like, say, the films from which the X-Files draws and kind of the pop culture from which the X-Files draws. And again, Fight the Future is kind of a repository of, Chris Carter's childhood cinematic influence, or the films that he grew up with as a teenager that really left his mark on it. And again, other minutes have probably talked about this already, or will talk about them again. Things like, for example, the huge alien influence on the actual plot in terms of what the colonists are doing, how the creature appeals, how it gestates. But even say at the end, the sequence where, spoiler alert, Mulder goes crawling through and gets chased through ducts by an alien monster. But even like the closing sequence in Foam Tatooine in Tunisia, which is an allusion to the fact that obviously Tatooine from Star Wars was shot, in the Tunisian desert. And therefore you have this kind of amalgam of kind of 70s kind of pop culture coming through into the X-Files. And again, that's not just in the film, that's in the TV show as well. I think famously, when Mulder is abducted in the 7th and 8th seasons, the set on which Mulder is kind of tortured by the alien bounty hunters was famously repurposed, or at least I think the map painting might have been, from the original Alien movie in 1979, very much kind of creating a kind of a sense of continuity there. For the purposes of the moment that we're talking about now, or even the sequence that we're talking about now, you have that real sense of kind of not necessarily even kind of 40s or 50s film noir, although that's obviously there in the sharp contrast of kind of like black and kind of color, or black and white, where you have a use of shadow, a use of shade, and a use of kind of light reflecting off, say, the puddles in there, or shining from the windows above the characters, in order to create kind of a very sharp contrast. But I mean, more particularly in terms of influences, we're talking about things like, say, All the President's Men. We're talking about the conspiracy thrillers. We're talking about movies usually starring Robert Redford, things like, I think, 3 Days of the Condor, to pick an example of a really, really, really good example of it. But even things like The Parallax View and various other movies like that, where you would have, and again, you can see it very much here in the sequence, in the way in which the well-manicured man is introduced and the way in which he's framed. It's this juxtaposition, and it's this juxtaposition of style. It's something that you don't need any dialogue to communicate. You don't need the characters to actually say anything, because there's not a lot of dialogue in this minute that we're talking about here. It's something that you get instantly from the image of a smart, well-dressed, middle-aged British man with a very black, very shiny car that has clearly just been washed and kind of polished, and the lights reflecting off it. And the juxtaposition of that with the fact that he's standing in this really seedy, really creepy alleyway. And again, any number of precedents, both from the X-Files as a TV show and from obviously its antecedents in terms of All the President's Men. The idea of Deep Throat famously meeting in the car park, of the hotel or whatever, where you have this kind of juxtaposition of one of the big insiders, one of the people who knows what's going on in the corridors of power, the kind of person who operates in the political spheres in Washington, D.C., which, by the way, is where this sequence nominally takes place. And then the idea that where he actually hangs out and where the power actually resides isn't inside the Oval Office or the corridors that lead up to it. It isn't in the halls of Congress. It isn't even in the Capitol building, although we'll get to that in a second. It is actually in the back alleys, in the car parks, in these really grimy, seedy and unpleasant places. And again, you have that kind of juxtaposition, which is as much visual as it is kind of thematic. It's the idea that these two elements don't belong together. And watching them and seeing them, you know that they don't belong together. And that kind of makes them more interesting. And again, that's arguably what film noir is. It's that kind of contrast between light and darkness. And again, notably, film noir kind of developed, in the 30s and kind of into the 40s. But even coming out of the Second World War, as America became prosperous, the film noir kind of aesthetic arguably reflected the idea that there was something uncomfortable happening beneath this surface of post-war America, where you had a nation that had nominally just fought a war against fascism, that had just sort of won, this kind of existential conflict, this battle between good and evil. It had literally fought a war that, at least in the narrative at the time, and if we're being frank, in actuality to a certain extent, was largely to prevent a Holocaust, a genocide. Like, if you were looking for a just war or a good war, the Second World War is as close as you're going to get. America had not only, like, won that war, it had emerged from that war as a global power, hugely prosperous, hugely successful. Its economy was booming. And again, you get that going into the late 40s, into the 50s, into the Eisenhower era. You have this idea then, this kind of juxtaposition of that prosperity, that success, that power, with the sense that there's something not quite right going on underneath it all. And again, when you think of the film noir imagery, and again, not necessarily even in the context of this scene, notably like Lights Through Venetian Blinds, for example, where you have this kind of contrast of black and white imagery, even black and white cinematography, which draws a sharp contrast between the two. It's all about juxtaposition. It's all about contrast. It's all about putting these elements in opposition to one another. I think you really kind of get that. And I think that even like the image of the well-manicured man in an alleyway is just a perfect expression of that sensibility, I think.
Yeah, I mean, just a couple of things that you mentioned there. That, like you say, in the Venetian blind thing, they use that. I know we're jumping ahead in minutes, but I think we're going to have quite a lot to talk about over these next few minutes, so we might jump around a little bit. If Cortlan can break the rules by cutting her minutes early by 5 seconds, I'm going to cut the rules by talking about other minutes. now we can break the rules. I'm going to break them, but no, things like the light coming through the back of the car, that's used quite a lot with like the heated, almost like windscreens and stuff that gives you that a feel of like the blinds coming through, and
the eyes in the mirror as well, like the driver's eyes in the mirror, the sense of being watched, of being paranoid, and the idea of like an eye watching you, watching it, and yeah, it's all there.
The other thing I wanted to pick up on, as you said about the Capitol building, it is the Capitol building. I am right with that, aren't I?
I'm assuming it is. It does look like it is. Again, keep in mind, neither of us are Americans, which, by the way, was something I very briefly wanted to ask, and I figure that you probably don't have a better idea than I do. But geez, alleyways are huge in America, aren't they? Like, while we're talking about just like technical in terms of production, like there are streets in I don't think Ireland has a street as wide as the alleyways in Washington DC, if Fight the Future is to be believed.
No. Well, the thing is as well, this is completely off piece, but I play a computer game called City Skylines, which is obviously based on American architecture, and the roads are just massive. Yeah. So yeah, everything's done threefold compared to England and Ireland. I can't imagine. And obviously Skinner, as we find out at the end of season 11, gets drawn over, and that's quite a thin alleyway compared to a lot of alleyways we see in
relatively speaking. Yeah, I mean, Skinner feels like he got hard done by it. It's like, what kind of alleyway is this? I mean, I will concede, I did some light research for this podcast. I know, gasp, right? But I was kind of curious about, well, first of all, Cookie, the boxer, who appears in all the posters behind Mulder.
Behind the bin, yeah.
Yeah, behind the bin. And they're very white, and they're like black and white pictures, and they look like they've been freshly plastered, which would lead me to believe the production team put them up. Maybe, I don't know. But I did a quick Google, and I couldn't find anything from around the time about a boxer named Cookie. So I'm very, very disappointed about that. I hope maybe our listeners might be able to shed some light on that. But I did also do some research about alleyways in DC, because apparently DC is notorious for its alleyways. Although again, and I kind of, one of those sentences which maybe puts this in perspective, which is like, many of the alleyways in DC are actually quite small. They're only 15 feet wide, which was quite an observation for me. That's a small alleyway. Is it only 15 feet wide? That's a modest alleyway. But again, like things like, say, blind alleys and stuff like that. But apparently, like, one of the interesting things, and again, we're going off on tangents, and I apologize, we will talk about stuff actually related to the X-Files in a moment. But apparently alleyways are actually vitally important to the evolution of DC as a city, because what you'd have is, you would have the upper and middle classes kind of living on the thoroughfares in the main buildings, and those buildings would be designed so that they would actually have wide alleyways behind them. See, I'm tying this back. So this is good podcasting right here.
Doing well.
They do have wide alleyways behind them, and they actually... what you'd have entire communities thriving in those alleyways. You have sort of like people who'd move in and they build houses in those alleyways because that was the only way to build affordable housing for the lower classes. And again, kind of one of the interesting social histories of DC is that up until I think around about the 1910s, 1920s, you actually had kind of like, they couldn't do a proper census of Washington, D.C. because the census takers wouldn't actually go down into these alleys. because they were so rough and so kind of messy.
Right.
And you wouldn't have garbage collectors couldn't go down there and couldn't actually collect trash. So it would kind of build up, and you'd have kind of rodent infestations and kind of disease and stuff in there. But what's interesting is that around about the 70s and 80s, ironically enough, they kind of came to be reclaimed. Which is kind of fascinating as well. And they've now, the alleyways at DC are apparently home to lots of boutique spaces and kind of lots of kind of like, fancy nightclubs, which probably makes sense, I think, when Mulder kind of stumbles out into an alleyway, but also even kind of like little boutiques and stuff like that as well. So it's kind of like a nice story of gentrification happening there. But I do find it interesting in the context of the X-Files or Fight the Future's use of that kind of Washington alleyway, because it does kind of feel a little bit, it feels almost, and again, probably because it actually is a different city, but it feels like a different world. One of the things that I really like about the production of this sequence, and again, I'm maybe jumping ahead to a later point that we will be discussing anyway, but is the way in which the editing in the sequence with the Well-Manicured Man, with the alleyways, and the Capitol building, and apologies if that is not the Capitol building, but I think it might be. But that sequence, the editing in that sequence does an excellent job of making it clear that Washington, D.C., which is obviously, the capital of the United States and kind of the center of power, theoretically speaking, kind of like the heart of America to a certain extent in terms of politics, in terms of, legislature, in terms of justice. It's very much the heart of the nation. But it kind of does this wonderful thing where it makes it very clear that, like, you have these grand, beautiful kind of architectural statements, and you also have these really seedy, really creepy, really crummy alleyways, and that they exist within a small turn off a road of one another. Which I kind of really like. I think it's a nice underscoring of kind of what's perhaps one of the core themes of the X-Files in a very visual way of kind of telling that story.
Alleyways Around the World, a Kurt and Darren podcast. Welcome.
We'll call it Blind Alleys because we're talking about things we have no idea. We've never actually visited any of these alleys. We're just talking about articles we've read about them.
Yeah, that'll be an amazing podcast. Anyway, let's we digress. But yeah, you mentioned about the fact that it's clearly it's been filmed in LA, and the in the book, it talks about it was filmed. A lot of the car scene was filmed on stage 16 using rear projection, which is obviously a staple of Hollywood and whatever. And the director of photography, I think it's David Wesky. I've probably really damaged that name. He was instructed to drive around LA because they couldn't find any stock footage of Washington DC, which I was quite surprised at, really. So he was sent out to record various different footage for it, and the projection image that they had for the wall, the projector, didn't have enough throw. So then, to get the appropriate distance from what was filmed, they had to have a truck outside actually projected onto a screen outside to delay that projected image so the throw would be right, so you're not getting either micro machine cars or like sort of huge monster trucks instead of like Rolls Royces, which is quite interesting in itself. But while we're here, I'm going to say just on this minute I'm going to take this and take it and run with it. I know it's a bit of artistic license here, but we have seen the death of Kurzweil, and I wanted to get your opinion on Kurzweil as a character through this film, because this is the final moment that we see of a car boot closing, but we do see it. What do you think to Kurzweil and the deep dives that were put in there with the likes of the fact he was an OBGYN, which relates back to Scully's abduction and the various stuff within the myth arc on that, his relationship to Mulder's father, and there's all these links that they're putting into Kurzweil. And what did you think to his character? I think all's well that's Kurzweil, as it were. Sorry, I couldn't make that work. Apologies for that.
But no, I think Kurzweil is a fascinating character. And again, you have the idea of the casting of Martin Landau, kind of a an icon in terms of American television, and therefore kind of creating this kind of link in the same way that you have the casting of Darren McGavin on both the X-Files and Millennium, kind of creating a kind of a textual bridge between the X-Files and Millennium and their own forebearers. So kind of casting Martin Landau in this role feels very much like it's kind of an acknowledgement of the show's kind of place in kind of television history, and like giving him a centerpiece role in a big cinematic adaptation. Again, I think we talked about it at least, but the kind of the way in which the show, or the way in which the movie avoids that many big special guest stars, and its big special guest stars tend to be kind of esoteric picks. So you do have like Blythe Danner, but she's in a tiny cameo. You have, for example, I think, was it Glenn Heady, who plays the bar woman, in a very tiny cameo as well. But you have then, on the other hand, you have, well, we're going to bring in as the head of the syndicate, brace yourself for this, Armin Muller-Stahl, because the kids absolutely love him, which I kind of love. It's such a weird pick. And again, Martin Landau feels very much like that. It feels a very kind of clever... It feels like the most important thing about Kurzweil is that he connects the X-Files to its kind of television history. And I do think that there is something interesting, and I'm not quite entirely sure about it. I'm kind of hesitant to kind of bring it up because I don't know what I make of it, let alone what anybody else does. This is, I think, one of the first times that you have Carter bringing up the idea of kind of like child abuse and child pornography as something that makes a character irredeemable, where you have the framing of Kurzweil as somebody who has had child pornography planted on his computer. But you see it happen, like, again, I think in the next movie, obviously, I Want to Believe, you have this idea of the pedophile priest and this idea of kind of redemption running through it. And I find it just an odd thing that the kind of movie comes back to, or that the X-Files comes back to, or that Carter comes back to a little bit in his work as well. I find it kind of an interesting, strange, recurring beat for him in terms of kind of material, in terms of characterization. And I find that a kind of an interesting aspect of Kurzweil, that it's like, that's an element that really doesn't need to be there. And kind of it jars a little bit when you watch it. And then when you watch kind of other stuff, when you watch like I Want to Believe, or even I think Is It Through a Dark Glass, in Millennium, has a similar kind of subplot as well. It's a very strange recurring motif for the show, I think. And it's particularly strange in the context of a gigantic summer blockbuster movie. So I do find that's the bit that kind of I can't really, the round peg in a square hole when it comes to Kurzweil.
I think you're right from that aspect. I mean, I talked about the aspects of the fact that, I mean, over in the UK recently, we've had people from MI5 were sexually abusing him and things like that. A nurse that said that and put all these accusations to people. And it was around the whole Jimmy Savile scandal and things, and just muddying the waters. And people haven't come back from that. You know, the fact that they've been they've been damaged by the power of what someone can say. And I can see the reason why they wanted to do that, but as you say, it seems to be a recurring motif that Carter does seem to come back to after this film, and whether or not that was by nature of the way that the X-Files developed over the years, that it became something he was interested in. And we're going to talk about other themes that he's interested in the following minutes, but it does feel like there's a progression here of even though Kurzweil, from what we can gather, is innocent of all these things, and the fact that they're just I'm trying to think what the word is. It starts with an S. But yeah, they're basically trying to say that framing him for that. So, but then obviously, as you say, it's a recurring motif. So it's just really interesting how and why it gets to that point, and then obviously it goes that far with I Want to Believe. It's an interesting development and progression for him.
I mean, I do think that there is something there in terms of, I think Carter is fascinated by the idea of forgiveness and redemption and how far you push that, and a point at which is there somebody who is past redemption. I think that, like, when you see what he does in Babylon, in the revival, where he does that with a terrorist, which is again, and again, you could argue similarly tastefully done in terms of kind of like elegance and kind of like finesse. But I think there is something interesting there. I think it's a very worthy idea. I think that Carter is I think it's a very brave thing for a writer to want to do, is to ask this question of, are there things that we as a society find irredeemable, and is forgiveness possible for people who are accused of doing these things, or should we not be so quick to judge people who have been accused of doing these things? But it always kind of sticks out when I rewatch it, because it's such a weirdly specific detail. Because it's like the rest of the movie is, generally speaking, a kind of a fun runaround. And the X-Files, could get dark and deals with very heavy themes and very kind of, you mentioned he's an OBGYN and things like that, and kind of like the abuse of kind of women's bodies and stuff like that is very much a recurring motif of the X-Files as well. But that sort of stuff isn't foregrounded in Fight the Future. Fight the Future is meant to be this kind of like cheery, breezy kind of runaround. It's, to a certain extent, the central tension in the movie is, will Scully get to her job interview on time? Will Mulder and Scully end up together at the end? And it does kind of, that's one of the things that whenever I'm watching it, they go into that level of detail, and I'm like, oh, okay, that's a pretty serious sharp turn that this lighthearted, this big blockbuster movie is suddenly taken. I do find it interesting in that sense. But outside that, Kurzweil is, he feels very much like a kind of a movie guest star, in that he's very much like, we got this actor who a lot of people in the audience will recognize from a thing. He's going to show up. He's going to provide Mulder with a bunch of information or exposition in the same way that Deep Throat does, in the same way that Marita Covarrubias has done, in the same way that X does. Except, this time, because we have a budget, he's going to be played by Martin Landau. He's very much kind of a function rather than a character. Outside of that, I think he's very much kind of, he fills a narrative purpose, as it were, and then the casting of that role fills a kind of a more broader thematic purpose, I think. I mean,
these next few minutes that we're going to talk about, we'll just move on from that now and wrap up this minute. But the actual speech itself is when Well-Manicured Man comes in and says, Mr. Mulder, what happened to Kurzweil? He's come and gone, which I love that line. I think it's great. He's come and gone, which is fantastic.
In an existential sense, it's like out in this cool alleyway here, and just didn't hang around.
So he's come and gone, and Mulder wants to know where Scully is. And in any other normal situation, you'd get, some abstract answer, but it's basically, here is the pouch and the knowledge and the information that you need to go and get Scully. Let's just expedite this really quickly. Yeah. Let's talk. Let's go.
Holding a literal plot device. Like, he's quite literally, I have given you the key to the final act of the movie. It's right here in my hand. All you have to do is just listen to some exposition to get it. That's it. That's the deal.
And I think that finishes off the minute. So, but just before I go, another thing with some of the editing and some of the direction work here, I really do like the walk that Well-Manicured Man and Mulder do when they're looking at each other, going to the car as well. I think that's really well done.
It is, and again, wonderful use of light and darkness there as well, and kind of like in particular like lighting and contrast and stuff. It does feel, I think the TV show always looked very cinematic, but even like little touches like that, you can see where having a bit more time to do a lighting setup on a scene makes a difference, even when the scene is nominally just exposition. You can see that where having the space to do that kind of allows the show to look just a little bit better. And obviously one assumes the massive amounts of money that Fox were throwing at this, but still, generally speaking, it looks gorgeous, even when it's just Mulder walking into a car for an exposition dump.
Yeah, exactly. But never mind. But it's so that wraps up our latest Fight the Future minute. Thank you everyone for listening. We'll be back tomorrow, and as I say, we're here for the next few days, so there's plenty to get our teeth into on this one. There's a lot of talking in a car, so and there's a lot to talk about, so we should do well.
There'll be a lot of talking on the podcast.
Exactly. So thanks, Darren. You'll be back, and we will head into minute 82 as we begin our little road trip around the Washington streets. So until our next minute, remember, as always, trust no one.
Elsewhere on We Made This. Life's milestones.
Whenever it was that there was that census where there was the campaign to try and get everybody to say that their religion was Jedi.
Oh, I remember it well. I think I did put Jedi, to be honest.
Yeah, well, I was adamant that I really wanted to put that down because it aligns a lot more with my beliefs than anything else. Star Wars has always been there for me. But yeah, that's when my mum was saying, no, we had you christened, and I ended up losing that one. And then when I lived on my own for a later census, I just, by that point, just put non-religious.
I'm in a band podcast.
Flaming Lips did a gig and they were all in bubbles. So the whole band, them big bubbles you get that you can play football in. The whole band were in them and all the people in the crowd were in one of them.
I'd go to the gig with a pin and fucking ruin everyone's evening.
You need a big pin.
Then you have to get out of your bubble first with your pin. They're going to see you.
You have a bubble with a pin on it. Or you're like a sea urchin just going around causing chaos.
Hey, rolling around.
Could you have a fag enough?
I suppose you could get your own bubble, innit?
Frame to frame.
So, Sean, have you got anything further you wanted to say on the two films that we've looked at this week?
I think they're both overlooked gems, and anyone who hasn't seen them needs to go and check them out pronto. Enough said.
I agree with you. We could have also called the theme for this week "Nerdy White Guy Tries to Find Love."
But are you having a go at me there?
No, I'm just saying
because I bore my heart when talking about the way back. I thought you were having a pop at me there.
No, absolutely not. I'm just saying that's what we could have called the theme for this week.
I mean, we could have done. It could have been like, podcaster recalls painful memory of riding bike in front of girl.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network.